Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. And we are going to take a look at layer blending modes. I've often said in all the teaching that I do that they're the most powerful tool inside of Photoshop because they truly enable the layer system to be able to create some truly amazing, unique effects, especially when you compound different layers in different layer blending modes together. So we're going to explore the most commonly used layer blending modes. I'm going to give you a very non-scientific explanation of what they do, and then we'll see some common uses of them in a couple of different portraits today. Now, this is centered toward the beginner, whether you're stepping into Photoshop for the first time or transitioning from Lightroom to Adobe Photoshop. If you've been around Photoshop for a few minutes, then you pretty much probably already know what I'm going to talk about, but hopefully this video will be short, so if you do decide to stay and continue to watch it, you might pick up something new. So with all that said, let's dive into the Photoshops and take a look at layer blending modes. Introductions, as always, to get us started. This is my wonderful friend Danielle. You've seen her in some of the previous videos here on the channel. If you'd like to see more of her amazing artwork, visit the Instagram account at the link below. In the description below for this video is a link to Adobe's website where there's an article that goes very in-depth into the scientific explanation of what each of the layer blending modes does in Photoshop, specifically what's happening under the hood in Photoshop to achieve the result. So after today's video, if you want a further, more scientific explanation and want to explore that, then just go to the description below and go to that link to Adobe's website. My goal today is to give you a general understanding of what the groups of layer blending modes do and explore a few basic options of them, and then we'll have some final thoughts for the video today. So to take a look at the layer blending mode window, it's right here in the layers window, but it's not accessible because we only have one layer, which is the background layer of this image. Arguably, most of the time, you're going to use layer blending modes with multiple layers in a scene. So to achieve this, I'm simply going to duplicate this layer by hitting Control or Command and the letter J. So now the background layer has been duplicated with an exact copy. It's named Layer 1, and we now have access to the layer blending mode window. I'm going to click it, and let's explore these and kind of go through their groups. Now, they are broken up into groups. The first group is normal and dissolve. Normal is just normal. Dissolve essentially takes the pixels and tries to do a randomized pattern like a dissolve, but 99% of the time in Photoshop, you're never going to utilize this, so let's forget about it for right now. The next group is darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, and darker color. Here's a general rule of thumb. The first blending mode in each group pretty much is the namesake of what they all do in that group. So darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color, all of those blending modes will make the layers beneath it darker in some shape or form, in varying ways to achieve that. The next group is lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. All of those do the namesake of lighten. They all make things brighter, but again, in varying ways of achieving it. The next group is overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light, linear light, pen light, and hard mix. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky and where we're going to unfortunately have to explore a little bit of science and under the hood for Photoshop. All of these, yes, technically do overlay to the image depending upon how it's used, but that's not actually what's happening, but it can be utilized that way. So let's explore the science of that, but let's finish up the other two groups really quickly. So the last group is difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide. I do use those in very niche moments in my artwork. They're very complex, and since this is beginner-friendly content on this channel, I don't necessarily want to explore those right now, but go to the Adobe site and you'll read paragraphs of science, and it just makes your hair turn gray. So the last section is hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. I use those a lot, and those are pretty self-explanatory. The last one, luminosity, is one that I use arguably most of the time, and it's, I would say, the most popular blending mode in that group. Let's explore the popular blending modes too before we go back to overlay and soft light. So in the section of darken, multiply, color, burn, linear burn, and darker color, the most popular blending modes in those, I would say, is multiply and color burn, at least in my experiences and travels of Photoshop for 20 years. The next group of light and screen, color dodge, and so forth, the two most popular there that I use is screen and color dodge. The third group, overlay, soft light, those are the two most popular. And then difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide, I use all four of them. The last one, like I said, is luminosity. And then color is kind of the second one that I use on the regular itself. So going back to overlay and soft light, let's do kind of a general overview of some of the under the hood of blending modes. All of these blending modes in Photoshop under the hood are going to try to approach a change to the layer in two ways, dealing with the luminosity values of the layer and dealing with the color of the layer itself. It's going to use that data, the data of the luminosity values, the data of the color. It's going to do something with those to achieve the result that we see. So when we talk about luminosity values in Photoshop, we're talking about highlights, shadows, and midtones. If we were to associate a color to that, because again, the blending modes deal with luminosity values and color data, then the colors for luminosity values would be white, black, and gray. White for the highlights, black for the shadows, and gray for those midtones. Specifically, 50% gray, because it's right in the middle. So with the light data information, which is technically a number, when we land right in the middle, we're at that 50% point that we have to travel the distance to the shadows or to the highlights. That's why it's called the midtones or 50% gray. So let's do a brief demonstration in an easy way to explore the blending modes, the most popular ones, and then to start understanding Softlight and overlay. I have a little graphic here. I'm going to bring this in to our picture of Danielle. I have a circle that's filled with black, circle filled with white, and one that's filled with specifically 50% gray. It's on a blending mode of normal. If I were to change it to the first popular blending mode in the first section of darken, I'm going to go to multiply. Then we can see, first and foremost, under the hood, the multiply blending mode is to tell Photoshop to ignore the color white. The white circle completely disappeared. The black circle has stayed exactly as it was, and the 50% gray circle is making anything that it sees, the layers below, darker by 50%. That makes sense. It's affecting all the light and color data of the layers below here in the layer stack. That gray circle is making it darker because we're on a blending mode of multiply. Again, the topmost one here is called darken. So let's go to screen. In screen, we can see that the black circle completely disappeared. The white one has returned. The white one is the normal one now. And the 50% gray is making everything brighter by 50% as it interacts with everything in it. Both the light data and the color data of all the layers below, it's making it 50% brighter. Let's go to Softlight. The gray circle has disappeared because the Softlight blending mode tells Photoshop to ignore the color 50% gray. But what it also does is it tells Photoshop on this layer that you have changed to the blending mode of Softlight, any color that's in this layer that is brighter than 50% gray from a luminosity perspective, it's going to make everything in the layers beneath it brighter. Any color that is darker than 50% gray, it's going to make any of the colors and luminosity values in the layers beneath it darker. So with the blending mode of Softlight, the gray circle in the middle is gone. The white circle is making things brighter and making things darker. So when we use the layer blending mode of Softlight to bring something into the scene and overlay it, we're going to choose to ignore the color gray, 50% gray, and let the other colors start darkening or brightening at the same time, whatever's beneath it. So the blending mode of multiply, it had no choice but to make everything darker. Screen made everything brighter. Softlight takes both, the combination of making things brighter and darker at the same time, because it's choosing that middle ground to ignore, and that's the starting point of where it says everything above that 50% gray will be brighter as it cascades forward in luminosity value. Everything below it will become darker. So overlay and Softlight, those two blending modes that we see in this group here. As you can see with overlay, it's much, much stronger. It's not as lessened with Softlight. So the white circle is making things a lot brighter or things a lot darker. It's a very stylized look. Overlay and Softlight are the two most popular blending modes to bring in textures, and that's the most common use for those blending modes, at least in my opinion, to bring a texture into the scene. So let's do that. This is a texture that I purchased from Adobe stock. It's one of my favorite textures to use because in the texture itself, you've got all this interesting, it looks like a wall with some plaster on it and so forth. It's really cool, but it also happens to be filled with three colors, white, black, and gray. And that's by design. So I'm going to bring this, well, of course, because that's the person made it that way. I'm going to bring it in. It's by design that I bought it because I really like it, because it doesn't have any major competing colors. It's dealing with colors in this specific layer that fall into the parameters of luminosity values: white, black, and gray, highlights, shadows, midtones. When I change this to a blending mode of soft light, instantaneously, the texture, if we zoom in just a little bit, it looks like the background of the studio is the texture itself. Now, that's partly to do with the texture having white, black, and gray, but if we notice, in the studio, I'm photographing Danielle in front of a piece of 50% gray seamless paper. I do that in almost every single photo shoot that I do. Now, even though this paper is technically 50% gray, in this image, that color is not 50% gray because of the studio strobe and the light that I was using. Up here, it's a lighter gray. Down here, it's a darker gray. That's due to the fall off of the light. But because it's gray, it's not a wall in the studio, it's not a blue background, a red background, or anything. It's gray. Any textures that I bring into the scene and change the blending mode to soft light, it's instantaneously going to interact with the background very easily. When I got my start as a photographer almost 20 years ago, this was the first way that I started adding textures to images of high school seniors, of brides and weddings, families. It was the fastest way to do it. As the technology of Photoshop evolved to include things like the quick selection tool, using the pen tool, the marquee selection tool to make selections of people so that they can be extracted from the image by using a layer mask, then you could properly add textures to the background. But simply doing it this way, by adding a texture that is neutral in color so that it will blend down on the blending mode of soft light with the layers below, all I have to do now with this layer is to add a layer mask to it. I'm going to click the layer mask icon, which will make a white mask or a reveal all, which means this entire layer is being revealed just as it was before we click the layer mask. The opposite of a white mask is a black mask or a hide all. When we put the black mask onto it, it hides the entire effect of this layer. We can no longer see that texture. If we paint white onto this mask, it will start to reveal the texture. If I invert the mask again to white, if I paint black onto this mask, it will take away the texture or hide it. So if I hit B for brush, and to make sure that my foreground color here is set to black by hitting the letter X, and then come up and expand my brush by using the right bracket key, I'm just going to start painting black onto this mask, which is hiding it. I would prefer to use the layer mask method, by the way, and that's my recommendation, instead of using the eraser tool in Photoshop. Because if I go outside the lines like this and I get rid of the texture and we can no longer see in the background, all I have to do is to switch my foreground color from black to white and paint and bring back that texture. Again, painting black just to make sure that it's gone on those key areas, and instantaneously, I've added a texture to the background. I didn't have to spend a whole bunch of money on a backdrop or paint the wall in the studio. All I had to do was use 50% gray paper and bring that texture into the scene. Let's do another demonstration. I'm going to grab this texture here, again, purchased from Adobe, but it is clearly not white, black, and gray. There's a lot of color into it and texture. I love using this texture. It's got a lot of those interesting scratches. If we change the blending mode to soft light, you can see that it's using the colors that are brighter than 50% gray, the colors that are darker than 50% gray, and it's trying to darken or brighten the scene based upon those. So over here on the texture, this was the brighter part. If I move it around, we can see that it's making Danielle brighter, but it's also taking on the color cast. So it's making her look a little blue. If I bring the dark red up into the scene, it's making her darker because that red is a darker color than 50% gray, and it's turning her a little bit red. So this texture doesn't blend into this scene as well. There's other ways we have to utilize it, and that gets into those more advanced techniques of using like the quick selection tool and making extractions and so forth. Again, since this content is beginner friendly, it's not something we're going to explore today. But if we were to use a layer mask very quickly and just paint black onto it and paint it away from her, this is a fast way to add the texture. You can paint black or white to recover, and we can add something quick into it. But since we have this mask, let's just explore some of these other blending modes we've talked about. So let's go to multiply. Of course, that doesn't look that great to me, but exploration is how you advance your tech and your understanding of Photoshop. I'm going to go to screen. Made everything a little bit brighter. It's interesting how it's interacting with her shorts and her legs and a little bit of her jacket, but ultimately it's not something that I think is that interesting. But this is a pretty radical texture, so to speak, based upon the idea of ignoring 50% gray. Think about other textures you may have as stock images that you purchased or you photographed yourself and how they can interact with the image. And then, of course, going back to soft light. So let me delete this, and I'm going to show you one more quick thing, and then we'll go into some of the basic uses of those blending modes for your portrait work. This is a lens flare that I created in Photoshop. It's very easy to create. We just make a new blank layer, fill it with the color black, because lens flares and special effects generally have to be rendered against the color black, and they are able to be seen the easiest against the color black. They technically don't have to be rendered against the color black, but that's how you see them the easiest. So I'm going to come up to Filter, Render, and then Lens Flare. The basic lens flare, the default settings, hit OK. Now we have our lens flare. If I bring this into the scene, this layer, and put it up top, on normal blending mode, it's covering up Danielle. If I explore multiply, makes everything darker except for that white hot point where we can see. Go to screen, everything is a little bit brighter. Well, I kind of cheesed it there, my bad. I meant to go to Softlight, because screen, as we did that little example a moment ago with the 3 circles, it tells Photoshop to ignore the color black. So this lens flare was rendered against the layer of black. Now the black is gone. So in all the fantasy composite work that I do, when I'm introducing a special effect into the scene, I always use the blending mode of screen, because it ignores that color black and is letting everything else interact, so that we can see the lens flare. If there were sparks or fire or laser beams or explosions, I would use the blending mode of screen to let it interact, because it's ignoring the color black. We go to soft light. Of course, it's making everything darker from the 50% gray perspective, and there isn't a lot of gray in this. It's either a white value of the lens flare or black, so it's making most of the image darker. So blending mode of screen is a common use of that blending mode when you're doing special effects inside of Photoshop. Just like soft light is a common use to bring in a texture into the image itself. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and I'm going to show you how you can use the pixel information in the image itself to start achieving some basic results. The pixel information of color and of light values, luminosity values in this scene. If I just take this duplicate layer and I change the blending mode to screen, it's making everything brighter. 20 years ago, when I started working in Photoshop, this is how I learned how to whiten the eyes in an image, by simply duplicating the layer and changing the blending mode to screen. Now, there's many other ways to do it now with the advancement of Photoshop and its technology, but this was one of the original ways to do it. And interestingly enough, this is still, to this day, the way that I do the whitening of the eyes in any image. So with this layer on a blending mode of screen, if I put a black mask onto it, hiding everything in that effect, and then I just simply paint white onto the mask where the whites of her eyes are, I can brighten up the whites of her eyes. I can also do it into the iris, which is how I used to long ago whiten the iris, or lighten the iris and whiten the whites of the eyes with one single layer. And of course, I say all the time on this channel, subtlety is key inside of Photoshop, so I would not leave the opacity of this one layer to 100% because it looks fake. I call it nuclear eyes. It looks terrible. So I'm going to reduce the opacity down to like 35%. We got a subtle little boost to the whites of the eyes, and the iris has been enhanced. Now, today, I do a different technique for the iris, but for the whites of the eyes, I still duplicate the base layer, change the blending mode to screen, put a black mask onto it, and paint white on that mask to reveal it over the iris. I'm going to delete this layer mask and change the blending mode to multiply. Put a black mask onto it, zoom in just a little bit. I'm going to paint white onto the mask to reveal it all the way around the edge of the iris ring, and then I'm going to paint it right into the center of the pupil. Not over the catch light from the studio strobe, but just in the pupil to darken it up. This was 20 years ago how I used to darken the iris ring and the pupil in the eye, simply by changing the blending mode to multiply and painting it in where I needed to see it. This is also how I used to do dodging and burning long ago, instead of using the classic tools of dodge and burn that are built into Photoshop. These tools, to be very kind, are terrible. Don't use these tools. If you've never done dodging and burning and you'd like to learn about that, take a look at the card above. It will take you to the retouching series here on this channel. It will show you the more modern way of doing dodging and burning that has a lot of user-friendly options and a lot of ways to expand it. So I used to do dodging and burning by simply making a layer that was darker using all the color and luminosity values in the actual picture, making things darker, and I would just start painting it in. Do the blending mode of screen and start painting it in to make things brighter. This is the way that you can utilize the existing information to achieve these things. But I want you to explore adjustment layers in Photoshop because adjustment layers are also incredibly powerful tools. So if we look at the adjustment layer window icon here, these are all the adjustment layers. These are essentially gateways that tell Photoshop what to do with the layers beneath them. So things like brightness and contrast, levels, curves, and exposure. Just like the blending modes, these are in a group, and all of these control light values, luminosity values within the image. One of the most popular and used most of the time is curves. This is a way to start adding light and affecting the light in the scene, or affecting the shadows in the scene or the midtones, because we're controlling luminosity values. So I can make an anchor point anywhere here on this curve. If I make one in the center, I'm dealing with the midtones, the luminosity value midtones. If I push it up, I can make the entire image brighter from across the board. If I bring it back down and delete that anchor point and grab this existing one here in the upper right hand corner and bring it this way, I'm making the image brighter starting from the highlights. Down here, starting from the shadows. And again, the anchor point in the center, making things brighter from the midtones or darker from the midtones. It's a more even-handed, easier of a transition of those highlights and shadows. Delete that anchor point. Now this blending mode for this adjustment layer has been on normal, but if I change the blending mode to Softlight, we get this interesting contrast into the scene, both from the luminosity perspective and the colors in the scene. The colors have become more contrasted. There's more drama to them. The luminosity values, there's more drama there. If I turn this off and duplicate the layer of Danielle and go to Softlight, the same thing happens. It's the exact same. But the key difference is this. With this duplicate layer of Danielle on a blending mode of Softlight, we are limited by all the pixel information in this layer. The luminosity values, the color values in the layer. There's nothing else we can do with this duplicate layer on the blending mode of Softlight. But if I turn a curves adjustment layer on and put it to a blending mode of Softlight, I have the ability to start adding more highlight and shadow into the scene and making anchor points along this line so that I can start controlling it even more strategically. So if I make an anchor point here and start bringing it up from the midtones, notice how the contrast and the colors is still staying there, but the luminosity values, it's getting a little bit brighter. Because again, this blending mode is affecting luminosity value and color at the same time. So I can start increasing it this way. I can bring it back down and make it darker. This is one of the techniques that I use to this day that is, I hate to use this term, it's a finishing move for my artistic process. It makes Photoshop sound like it's a video game, but this is one of the things that I do in my work. This simple technique of adding an adjustment layer that has a curve and changing the blending mode to Softlight. Let's do a demonstration of that, and we'll finish up this video with some final thoughts. This is another image from the photo shoot with Danielle, and this has been completely retouched and edited except for one final thing, which is the finishing move of adding the curves adjustment layer to it and changing the blending mode to Softlight. So when I do, look at the amount of contrast, the colors, the light values, everything, the quality and stylization of the artwork that we get with this adjustment layer. No changes have been made to it, but the blending mode has been changed to Softlight. Here is the after, the before and after, before. Look at the greenery behind her. Look at how much more the rich luminosity tones are coming through, as well as the color tones being affected by this curves adjustment layer, giving us that contrast. If I were to make an anchor point in the contrast and start strategically working with it and trying to get some interesting effects, this is known as an S curve in the curves adjustment layer. This was the classic way that you would add contrast many years ago to a scene. Now there's many other advanced ways of doing it now with differing results, but we can still use some of those classic methodologies and techniques in Photoshop to be able to achieve an artistic result. Again, the before and the after. And how we can use this tool that's meant to control luminosity values. But because we changed the blending mode to one that lets color and luminosity values come into play with the layers beneath it, we are starting to create some really interesting, beautiful results in this scene. So that's the general overview of the blending modes, the most popular ones, what they do, and of course in the description below is that link to Adobe. Let's finish up this video today with some final thoughts. I've often said that you have to learn why things work in Photoshop. And that is absolutely true, especially when it comes to layer blending modes. So understanding a little bit of the science and what happens under the hood with those different blending modes will help you to understand why things work in Photoshop. But the best way to do that The best way to learn why things work in Photoshop and to explore these blending modes is to simply explore it and experiment on your own. I wish I had a better answer for you, and I always want to tell you the truth on this channel. You're going to have to go on that journey alone. You've learned some of the common uses of it, some of the most popularly used blending modes. But the greatest way to learn is to experiment, to find results on your own, because you're going to start landing on things that are important to you and your artistic style. There are so many things to explore in Photoshop that if you wait for somebody to tell you every single thing and what it does, you will amass so much knowledge that I fear you will not have the connective threads of all of that information and know how to use that information to achieve the results you're looking for. When I started teaching myself Photoshop years ago, I started by duplicating the layer, going to every blending mode and seeing what it did, and most importantly, changing the opacity of the layer as well. Because as you see, an opacity of 100%, it's very heavy-handed. Even if you duplicate the layer, change the blending mode to Softlight, it's a beautiful contrasted effect. But if we reduce the opacity by 75%, another 25% to go down to 50, what if we start using adjustment layers? Like a solid color adjustment layer. It just adds a layer filled with color and you get the ability to move it around and control it. We change the blending mode from normal to lighten. It's going to use a color to lighten the shadows in the scene. Well, at an opacity of 100%, that's a very intense effect. But if we reduce the opacity to, let's say, 35%, you get a beautiful artistic result. That is one of the common techniques that I do to this day in my color grading work and my artistic process. And I learned it long ago by simply experimenting. There was an entire week, I remember it to this day, that I sat down and went, I'm going to learn every one of these blending modes. And I'm going to learn what these adjustment layers do on every single blending mode, and change the opacity and the fill and use a layer mask. And I experimented. And as I found things that I liked, I wrote it down, how I got there. I eventually built, as I commonly and jokingly refer to it, as a bag of tricks, techniques and tools to use in Photoshop to achieve the results that I see in my imagination, what I want to create in my artwork. I encourage you. I know it can be a little frightening. Go on the journey. Sit down with an image that is photographed from a lighting controlled environment like a studio or a natural light image outside. Duplicate the layer and go through every blending mode. Change the opacity, then start using adjustment layers on top of that image. And then, once you understand the adjustment layers and the blending modes, start compounding those effects. Duplicate the layer, change it to a blending mode like Softlight, reduce the opacity to 50%. Then create a solid color adjustment layer. Change that blending mode of that solid color adjustment layer to lighten and change the opacity of that solid color adjustment layer to 35%. And see how it works. See how it affects the scene. Write it down, because then you start developing your artistic style because you took the time to learn why things work in Photoshop. That's the end of this video today. If you like the content that you found in it, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel, because new content debuts each week in photography and Photoshop education. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified of that content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.